There is nothing natural about developing Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. These are not natural consequences of aging. One of the early symptoms of Parkinson's is constipation.
Dr. Ray Dorsey,
the best-selling author of Ending Parkinson's Disease.
He knows the cause of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's.
And is on a mission to save your brain before it's too late.
1 in 3 of us who live to 85 will develop Alzheimer's disease. And when I see someone with Parkinson's, I get pissed off, because I think it's preventable and there's no reason that people need to have suffering. Chemicals in our environment, especially in our food, water, and air, are fueling the rise of these diseases. If you don't get exposed to these chemicals, you're really unlikely to develop Parkinson's disease. If you're not exposed to air pollution, your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is dramatically reduced.
Let's move on to a common dry cleaning chemical, trichloroethylene.
1 in 3 American cities have this chemical in its drinking water. And this chemical is associated with a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. I used to think the food I ate, the water I drank, and the air I breathed was safe. I no longer believe that.
What are your thoughts about milk, and does that cause brain disease?
High milk consumption is associated with Parkinson's disease. I get less concerned about milk in and of itself. I get concerned about what's in the milk. The answer to improving our health is not spending more on doctors and hospitals. The answer to improving our health is to improve our environment.
Do you think that would substantially decrease the incidence of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's?
Without a doubt. And not only would it do that, it'll decrease the risk of cancer and lots of other health ailments.
We are told that Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease starts in the brain, and there's nothing that we can do about it. But my guest today, Dr. Ray Dorsey, and his team has new scientific evidence to prove that brain diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's don't start in the brain, and they're actually caused by environmental toxins. Now, this is not to alarm you, but if we can make informed decisions about our health, we can actually prevent brain disease. And before we start, I have a favor to ask. It is our mission on this health podcast to spread the message of root cause healing. That means the food that we eat has the power to heal disease. And you can help with this mission by hitting that subscribe button. Because I think we know that big food and big pharma, they're most likely not going to help with this mission, but we can change that. And over the last year, we've grown to over 200,000 subscribers. But I think we know that there are millions more people that need to hear this message. Thank you. Dr. Dorsey, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Rena. Delighted to be with you.
Many people know somebody that has had a brain disease like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. And if you ask a doctor, most likely they'll say that there's nothing that we can do about these diseases. But Dr. Dorsey, you say that these diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are man-made and entirely preventable if we avoid certain toxins and certain foods. So today, Dr. Dorsey is going to share his 20 years of experience and talk about the root cause of diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, the toxins that we need to avoid, and most importantly, the 3 simple steps to save our brain. But Dr. Dorsey, my first question, what is the likelihood that somebody gets Parkinson's or Alzheimer's in their lifetime?
Rena, delighted to be with you. Everyone calls me Ray. So unfortunately, it's really common. For Alzheimer's disease, 1 in 3 of us who live to 85 will develop Alzheimer's disease. Said another way, if you and your spouse or partner aspire to live to 85, there's a more than 50% chance that at least one of you will have Alzheimer's disease. Parkinson's disease is the world's fastest growing brain disease. Today in the United States alone, 200 people will be diagnosed with it, and another 100 people will die with it. And in general, brain diseases are now the world's leading source of disability, more than cancer, more than heart disease, more than infectious disease. And brain disease is also the world's second leading cause of death.
So why is this happening?
I think for many of these diseases, especially Parkinson's, but also diseases like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease and Alzheimer's, even autism and intellectual disabilities, I think chemicals in our environment, especially in our food, water, and air, are fueling the rise of these diseases, including Parkinson's disease. Many of these diseases are new. They've only been recently described in the last 100 or 200 years. When they were initially described, they were really rare, and now they're growing rapidly and destroying lives, families, and crippling societies.
Many doctors will say that if you have something like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or even dementia, it is genetic. it is caused by aging. There's nothing that we can do about it. So, as a brain doctor for the last 20 years, what's your take on that?
There is nothing natural about developing Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. You put a laboratory mouse in the lab for years, they don't spontaneously develop Parkinson's disease. Generally speaking, they don't spontaneously develop Alzheimer's disease. These diseases are not, by and large, for some, there are genetic components to some of these diseases, but by and large, these are not natural consequences of aging. No more than smoking, no more than lung cancer is a natural consequence of aging. If you don't smoke cigarettes, you're very unlikely to develop lung cancer. If you don't get exposed to these chemicals, you're really, 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 really unlikely to develop Parkinson's disease. If you're not exposed to air pollution, your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is dramatically reduced. Now, these diseases have genetic components to them. About 15% of people with Parkinson's disease have a family history of the disease. Said another way, 85% don't. And about 15% of people have an identifiable genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease. But only 1% of individuals with Parkinson's disease have Parkinson's disease due to a purely genetic cause. For the vast majority of people who have a genetic risk factor, the majority of those people with that genetic risk factor will never go on to develop Parkinson's disease. There have to be other factors that cause people, even with genetic causes, to go on to develop the disease.
I'm very glad that you said that, because I think when people develop such a disease, they just think there's no possible scenario where I could get better. But in this episode, this interview with you, there is hope. There is hope that you can actually thrive as a human if you have a disease like a brain disease. So you have seen a lot of patients in your practice because you are a brain doctor. What are the most common brain diseases that you are seeing in your patients? But secondly, how many of those cases are preventable?
Well, I'm a Parkinson's specialist, so almost everyone that I see has a Parkinson's disease, and I think for almost all of these individuals, Parkinson's is preventable. I'm a neurologist, so I go around looking for Parkinson's disease, when I'm in the airport, when I'm walking or biking. And when I see someone with Parkinson's disease, I get pissed off because I think it's preventable. And I know the suffering that people are going to encounter in the future. I know the suffering that their friends and families are going to experience. And I think that for the vast majority of people, this is entirely preventable. And there's no reason that people need to have suffering. Suffering is part of the human condition, but needless preventable suffering should be prevented.
What do your other colleagues say about the treatment of Parkinson's disease? Do they agree with your approach?
I think many of my colleagues are much more skeptical about the environmental causes. And quite frankly, I was too. About 6 years ago, I had the gift of a sabbatical as an academic. And I read the work of my colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner, who's not only a Parkinson's specialist like me, but also an epidemiologist, has a PhD in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley. And I read her work for the last 40 years, and she's been politely and quietly and kindly telling us that Parkinson's disease is due to environmental causes. 25 years ago, she did a landmark study looking at rates of Parkinson's disease among identical twins and fraternal twins. And if something has a really high genetic component, identical twins are going to have a really high concordance rate. They're both likely to carry the disease, whereas fraternal twins who don't share the same genome are going to have be less likely to have it. She found that there was no difference between identical twins and fraternal twins in their likelihood of both carrying the disease, suggesting that for the vast majority of individuals with Parkinson's disease, genetics is only a small contributing factor, and environmental causes are the principal causes of the disease. And she told us this 25 years ago.
Apart from hearing from your work and all the research and everything that you're doing in the world of Parkinson's, I'd never heard, and we're going to talk about what the environmental toxins are, I had never heard that air pollution and, for example, constipation can cause brain disease and Parkinson's disease. It's crazy.
Yeah, so it's air pollution. I think constipation is an early feature, early symptom of the disease, which actually is giving us a clue to where Parkinson's disease might be beginning, in some cases in the gut. We can get to that in a little bit. But yes, toxicants in our environment, food, water, and air, especially certain pesticides, a pesticide called paraquat, certain dry cleaning chemicals, if you can believe, dry cleaning chemicals, including a chemical called trichloroethylene and another one called perchloroethylene, and air pollution, I think, are the three major environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease in the United States and likely around the world.
Okay, so there are so many things that we're going to talk about in terms of how we can prevent all these brain diseases? Because a lot of them share from Parkinson's to Alzheimer's. Parkinson's is a bit more specific in terms of ways that we can reduce the chances that people get it. But before we get to that, it's important to understand how the brain works. Because I think if people can understand how the brain works, they'll understand where the damage occurs and how they can prevent it. So my question for you is, what are the main parts of the brain and what do they control?
There are many different parts of the brain, and neurologists like me tend to look at it from an anatomical structure, and that different parts of the brain control different parts. So when you're talking to me, I'm hearing and understanding what you're saying, but in an area part of the brain called Wernicke's, which is on the left part of my brain. When that information is then conveyed to a part of my brain where it generates speech called Broca's area. And so there's a loop that's responsible for language. And just like there's a loop responsible for language, there's a loop responsible for vision. So when I see you, it gets processed, goes through my retina, and then back to the part of my brain that processes it, and eventually back to the occipital lobe. And there's a part of our brain that's responsible for movement. And there's a part of our brain that's responsible for memory. And in people with Parkinson's disease, is that circuit that's responsible for one of the circuits that's responsible for movement. There are multiple. One of the circuits that's responsible for movement is damaged. In Alzheimer's disease, one of the circuits that's responsible for memory is damaged. Now, we don't know why a chemical like air pollution, for example, is linked to both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And we don't know, at least I don't know, why some people who are exposed to that chemical get to air pollution develop problems with memory and some develop problems with movement. But the circuits that are impacted lead to what diseases are manifested.
That's why when people hear about different disease states, it affects different parts of the brain. So when we talk about Alzheimer's, it affects the hippocampus. When we talk about Parkinson's disease, it affects the substantia nigra. So it's important to understand how the brain works. I think that people think that brain diseases are all in one, but there are different parts that can be affected. Interestingly, you said that patients that have Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's, they have elevated iron levels are found in the brain. Why is that?
Yeah, so in individuals with Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, when you look at their brains under the microscope or after they die, you see high levels of iron. And your brain is really, really, really selective in terms of what it lets in and what it lets out. And it's not terribly keen to bring in heavy metals into the brain because many of these heavy metals can be toxic to brain cells. And it's not really clear how the iron got there. Some people have looked at nutrition, but largely they found that people who have a high iron diet are more likely to have iron in the brain, because I think the brain's really good at protecting itself from excess dietary intake of different chemicals. But the nose, I think, is the front door of the brain, and the nose bypasses the normal blood-brain barrier that protects the brain, and I think it's exploiting it. And so when you see air pollution, you can actually see air pollution like in Los Angeles. You see a haze, and that haze is made up of little pieces of dirt and soot. It's called particulate matter. Hitchhiking on the pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals like lead from leaded gasoline, iron from brakes, and platinum from catalytic converters. So I think that iron is hitchhiking on these little tiny pieces of dirt and soot, are being inhaled, going through our nerve responsible for our smell, and going back to the smell center of our brain, and then spreading to other parts of the brain. I think that's how iron is entering our brain. And we increasingly know that from studies that high levels of air pollution increases your risk for Parkinson's disease and especially Alzheimer's.
And so that's interesting that you also say Parkinson's disease, it doesn't start from the brain.
Yeah, so I think in 2000, so we think Parkinson's disease is a brain disease and classically causes tremor, slowness of movement, problems with balance, and a shuffling gait. In 2003, a really smart German pathologist, Heiko Brock, postulated that Parkinson's disease, a brain disease, does not begin the brain. He said when you look at under the microscope, you first see the pathology of Parkinson's in the smell center, which we were discussing right above the nose, and we see it in the nerve cell body of the vagus nerve, which you might know connects the brainstem all the way down to the gut. And because of this, the latter finding, he thought that Parkinson's disease was due to neuroinvasion from an unspecified toxin. He thought maybe a virus. I think that's less likely, or only a small contributor, that enters in through the gut, then rides up or leads to pathology spreading up the vagus nerve into our brainstem, and then to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement, those motor circuits that are controlled. And even now, 20 years later, my colleague, Dr. Borkhammer, and some of our friends and I just wrote a paper arguing that Parkinson's disease, most of Parkinson's disease begins in the nose through inhaled toxicants, inhaled air pollution, inhaled pesticides, inhaled dry cleaning chemicals, or less commonly for Parkinson's disease, is ingested through ingested pesticides, ingested dry cleaning chemicals that are in our water, or even probably less likely, small amounts of air pollution are actually swallowed as well.
So the question is for you, is that the same as Alzheimer's, the same cause?
So I'm not an Alzheimer's expert. I know Parkinson's a lot better than Alzheimer's. I get really concerned for Alzheimer's about air pollution. The studies linking air pollution to air pollution to Alzheimer's disease are increasingly common. We even know that people who have a genetic risk factor, some of your listeners might know there's an ApoE4 allele, a different variation of a gene that's linked to Alzheimer's disease. And so Alzheimer's has more of a genetic component than Parkinson's. But even people who have that genetic component appear to have an interaction with pesticides that with air pollution that heightens their risk. So I think for Alzheimer's disease, air pollution is a really, really big contributor to the disease. And there are other likely environmental causes for Alzheimer's disease, but I think that's the big one for Alzheimer's.
As you can hear from Dr. Ray Dorsey, the toxins in our environment can negatively impact our brain. Another very common problem we have in our society is too much blue light, especially in the evenings. I'm sure that many of you look at your phone, your tablet, and watch TV in the evening. Well, these devices emit what's called blue light, and constant exposure to blue light over time can actually impair your vision because blue light can damage your retina cells over the long term. It can also affect your sleep because blue light can suppress melatonin production. And that's why I have BonCharge as a sponsor of today's video. BonCharge produces high-quality blue blocking glasses that block 100% of blue and green light between 400 and 550 nanometers. Now, this is important because this is the amount of blue light that is typically emitted from your phone and other digital devices. And I have used these Morris blue blocking glasses from BonCharge, which are optimized for better sleep. I just pop these on about 3 hours before sleep, and I find that I have a better night's sleep. I can get to sleep easier, and I wake up feeling more refreshed. And if you're super keen on improving your rest and recovery, you can also invest in red light therapy because red light therapy has been proven to improve your cell's mitochondria. And I have used BonCharge's mini red light device. This has red and infrared light at 660 to 850 nanometers. Red light therapy can help you have younger, youthful looking skin. It can help with blemishes and scarring and also help with rest and recovery. So if you'd like to try BonCharge's blue blocking glasses or their red light therapy, just head to boncharge.com/5minute body. And right now, BonCharge is offering my viewers a special 25% discount until the 31st of July. All you have to do is use code 5MB25. And if you're watching this after the 31st of July, you can still get 15% off with code 5MB. So when it comes to Parkinson's disease, there is a misfolding protein that occurs. Can you discuss, in the most simplest terms, how the process starts and then what actually happens in the part of the brain which is called the substantia nigra, how that gets damaged from the misfolding proteins?
Yeah, so we don't actually know it completely, but I'll give you my best attempt. So almost every cell in the human body has a DNA or genes, and genes are just pieces of DNA, and these DNA give you instructions to produce proteins, and proteins carry out all the functions of our body. Neurotransmitters, transporting proteins, hormones, lots and lots of functions that proteins carry out. And as they're being built based on the instructions from DNA, they become really, 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 really long. And as they get longer and longer, they need to fold over and over. Otherwise, they would burst out of the cell. And the process of folding, sometimes these proteins are misfolded. They can become misfolded because of a genetic mutation, or they can become misfolded in response to toxins in our environment. Now, if you take the example of Parkinson's perhaps beginning in the gut, it could be that ingested toxins, say a pesticide, is ingested and leads to misfolding of a protein in the gut. That misfolded protein we know can spread from nerve cell to nerve cell. Your gut is innervated, right? It moves stool along. And so misfolding of a protein in the gut can then spread via the vagus nerve. Think of that as a superhighway that goes from your gut and your intestines all the way up to the brainstem and leads to misfolding into your brainstem. That misfolded protein then goes from the nerve cell, the vagus nerve, and then spreads up eventually into the part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And so you get misfolding of the protein in the substantia nigra. So actually, by the time you get the misfolding the substantia nigra, which is part of the circuit that controls movement, that's actually mid-stage development of Parkinson's disease. And that whole process, beginning from ingesting the toxin to the misfolded protein in the gut, spreading up via the superhighway to the brainstem, then spreading from the brainstem up further higher to the substantia nigra, takes years, decades, or even generations to unfold. So it could be that you get exposed to these chemicals perhaps as early as childhood, perhaps as early as in utero, and years, decades, or generations later, you're developing the clinical symptoms of Parkinson's disease, the classic tremor and slowness of movement that we classically associate with the disease.
So we're going to talk about exactly what we can do to avoid all of these pollutants and all these different solutions. I wanted to circle back to the substantia nigra. It's a very interesting part of the brain because it produces dopamine producing neurons. Can you talk about, and we think that dopamine is related to drive and motivation. How does dopamine control movement in the body?
So the substantia nigra is part of the circuit. The fancy term is basal ganglia. I try to avoid the fancy terms, but basal ganglia is this circuit. And it turns out that dopamine-producing nerve cells, that these nerve cells communicate to one another not through words. They do it through chemicals. And one of the chemicals that they use to communicate between one another is a chemical called dopamine. It turns out that these dopamine-producing nerve cells in substantia nigra have some unique properties to them. One, they're really, 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 really big. They have 1 million different connections. If you stretched them out, they would be 4 meters in length, twice my height. Second is that they aren't well insulated. They just like wires are often insulated in your home so that they're more efficient in conducting electricity. Nerve cells are usually, many nerve cells are insulated with a protein called myelin. Turns out that these nerve cells are not insulated. So they have huge energy demands. And so how do cells get energy? Well, they have a little engine inside them that are called mitochondria that take sugar and convert that to energy. And so these nerve cells in the substantia nigra are huge. Think of them as a huge, big garbage bag, and they're filled with jelly beans. And those jelly beans are mitochondria that produce the energy that these cells require to function. Well, it turns out that misfolded protein and some of these environmental chemicals damage the energy-producing parts of nerve cells. And that damage to energy-producing those energy-producing parts of nerve cells leads to dysfunction of those cells. So those cells are selectively damaged, selectively harmed, and I think that's why we see the classic motor features, movement features of Parkinson's disease.
Okay, so let's move on to these damaging toxins that are destroying our brain. Before I ask that, have you had any patients that have had Parkinson's that have not cured it but gotten better by avoiding these toxins?
So we don't know. So if you smoke and you get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing your doctor is going to tell you to do?
Stop smoking.
Stop smoking. So if you're a farmer and getting exposed to pesticides and you get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, what should be the first thing that your neurologist should tell you to do? Stop getting exposed to these pesticides, but we don't. So no one's actually studied the effects of stopping exposure to these toxicants. There is some suggestion, for example, that air pollution in people who already have Parkinson's disease leads to an increased risk of hospitalization and perhaps greater progression of disease. So one of the first things I tell people with Parkinson's disease is stop getting exposed to these toxicants. Just like I tell this person with lung cancer who is smoking, stop smoking. It can't be helpful to you, and it can't be helpful to you, and it might be quite harmful to you. So I think the first thing you should do if you're exposed to these chemicals, if you get Parkinson's disease, is stop getting exposed to toxins that we know are related to Parkinson's disease. And there are lots of ways to do that, from buying organic to washing your fruits and vegetables, to putting a carbon filter on your water at home, to getting an air purifier for your house, to stop using pesticides in your yard, to avoiding golf courses that use high levels of pesticides, to thinking about where you live. I mean, there are hundreds of ways that we can think about decreasing exposure to these toxins.
So that is the first thing that we have to look at, is air pollution. So when you look outside, let's just say that you live in a major city or even the countryside, how do you know if you have air pollution there?
Some places you can just see it. So if you're in LA, you can just see it. Another thing is you can just check your phone and it, give you an air quality index and tells you what level of particulate matter, which I think is the most important contributor to these brain diseases, is in your air. Just last summer, we had the Canadian wildfires, which led cities like New York turn the skies of the Big Apple orange. I mean, you could see it, and you have to think to yourself, that's probably not really good for our health. And if you think about it, you're breathing it in, and you can even you can taste it. You can feel the burning sensation. And that high level of air pollution is exactly what was happening in 1800 London when Dr. James Parkinson first described the condition. So Dr. Parkinson, the first major description of Parkinson's disease occurred in 1800 London, when the air over London looked like the air in New York City during the Canadian wildfires. I don't think it's a coincidence that Parkinson's disease was first described at the height of the Industrial Revolution in the city that was the capital of the Industrial Revolution, at the same time that air pollution was so bad you couldn't even see across the street. And people were covering their mouths, not because of fear of infectious diseases like COVID-19, obviously, but because of the toxic effects of air pollution.
What was the incidences of Parkinson's when it was first invented in, I think you said 1817?
Yeah, so when Dr. Parkinson's 61 years old, he's a British surgeon, and he says, I'm describing something that has not been classified in the medical literature. He was a student of the history of medicine, and he said tremor has long since been described. Smith and Jones and McCormick all described tremor, but this new disease, this disease that had not been classified in the medical literature, with a resting tremor, a stooped posture, and a shuffling gait, and this propensity to walk faster and faster in a fall, this is something new or novel. He described 6 people with the condition. 6 people with the condition. 200 years, the global burden of disease estimated that over 6 million people had the disease. So you went from a disease that was being rare and affecting 6 people to 6 million in the span of 200 years. It obviously can't be genetics, and aging alone was insufficient to account for this rise. It has to be things in our environment. And if you look at the map of the world, the areas of the world that are most industrialized, like the United States and Canada, have the highest rates of Parkinson's disease. Areas of the world that are least industrialized, like sub-Saharan Africa, have the lowest rates of disease. And areas of the world undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like India and China, have the fastest increasing rates of disease.
So the first toxin to be aware of is air pollution. Okay, let's get to the next one. Pesticides.
Yeah, so the poster child for this is a pesticide called paraquat. It's considered the most toxic weed killer ever created. It was developed in the 1950s. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's so toxic that it's been used to commit homicide and suicide. The EPA's own website says that one sip can kill. Over 50 countries, including China, have banned it, but the United States has not. In fact, use of paraquat in the United States has doubled in the last 5 years. It's sprayed in virtually every state in the country. It's sprayed on vineyards 30 minutes from where I live in Rochester, New York. I'm here in Colorado today. I'm sure it's being sprayed here in Colorado, and it's sprayed in the Central Valley of California. Dr. Tanner, the neurologist and epidemiologist that I mentioned earlier, over a decade ago showed that farmers who were exposed to paraquat had a 150% increased risk of developing the disease. Researchers, including one of my colleagues at the University of Rochester, 25 years ago demonstrated that when you feed paraquat to laboratory animals, they develop the clinical and pathological features of the disease. If you don't believe any of that, an expose done by a really great journalist, Kerry Gillum, for The Guardian, looked at legal documents from the company who manufactures paraquat. They're being sued by some farmers who are asserting that their Parkinson's disease was likely caused by this pesticide paraquat. It turned out that the company's own research, according to The Guardian, and then demonstrated that that 3 different mammals, mice, rats, and rabbits, when exposed to high doses of paraquat, developed features of Parkinson's disease. In the 1960s, they did that, before I was born. So the company manufacturing paraquat has known for over 50 years that their product produces the features of Parkinson's disease when fed to mammals.
So why is it still used in the US?
That's a good question, and I don't have a great answer for you. I think it's a question that should be asked to the Environmental Protection Agency, to be asked, why is this pesticide that's been banned by over 50 countries, including China, Syria, the United Arab Emirates? It's banned in the country in which the chemical company is located. England manufactures the product, but bans it in its own in England. So England manufactures it, but bans it in England, but it's willing to export it to Brazil, Mexico, and the United States.
As Dr. Dorsey explains, we need to be very aware of environmental toxins, including air pollution and pesticides, especially if we want to optimize our brain and optimize our health. But we also need to consider what we eat, because our food has been directly linked to chronic diseases like heart disease, cancer, and brain disease. Now, you may have heard of a carnivore diet. It has helped millions of people reverse chronic disease like heart disease, cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's. And I have been following a carnivore diet for the last 4 years and had amazing results with my own health. But when I started carnivore, I had no support. My doctor was telling me, you're going to get a heart attack from eating so much saturated fat and meat. That's why I started a community, which has now grown to over 12,000 members, and they all want the same thing, optimal health. So whether you're considering a carnivore diet, I'd love to invite you to join our Go Carnivore community. Every week, we pack so much information for you to support you and our members. We have keto and carnivore doctors every single week that can help answer common medical questions that you might have. We also have coaches that have been doing this lifestyle for over 14 years. We have fat loss challenges, meal plans, and a list of over 800 keto and carnivore doctors to help support you. So if you'd like to join, just head to gocarnivore.com, or you can join the free 90-day carnivore challenge. So what is the use of pesticides for people that might not know? Why would they want to use paraquat and things like Roundup?
So I'm not a farmer, but paraquat pesticides in general are really good at controlling pests. And they really have had beneficial effects. So the real first major application of man-made pesticides, synthetic pesticides, was World War II, when pesticide called DDT was used to prevent people from getting malaria. And it prevented thousands, if not millions, of people from getting malaria. But in 1962, Rachel Carson, a scientist, wrote a book, Silent Spring, arguing against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. It's not that she was saying that pesticides in and of themselves are not beneficial, because they do have beneficial effects. They prevent crops from being destroyed by insects, prevent crops from being destroyed by weeds, prevent crops from being destroyed by fungi. It's the indiscriminate use of these pesticides, and dangerous ones, and companies knowingly marketing products that they know are harmful, that are contributing to the rise of these diseases. And if you look at DDT, after World War II, it got a hero's welcome. It was sprayed on children on the beaches in New Jersey. There are pictures that people can Google and see the pesticide truck spraying DDT and kids following behind it. Its use increased 40 to 80 fold. And we know that pesticides like DDT and its class of pesticides dissolve in fat, and we can find them in our fatty tissue. Like almost all of us have DDT or metabolites of DDT in our fatty tissue today. And we know that these pesticides have a number of different harmful effects, ranging from developmental disorders, including intellectual disabilities, to cancer, to Parkinson's disease, depending on the type of pesticide.
Let's talk about what we can do to avoid that a bit later. What about pesticides in water?
Yeah, so Dr. Tanner and her colleagues, Dr. Beata Ritz, a researcher at UCLA, and her colleagues have demonstrated that people who drink well water, about 40 million Americans get their water not from city water, which is regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, but from private wells on their own property. These wells are often relatively shallow. They tend to be in rural areas where farming is conducted nearby, and pesticides can be washed off farms and sink into the ground and contaminate groundwater from which the wells derive their water. And so people who drink well water have about a 75% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease because they are likely, in some cases, develop drinking water that's contaminated with pesticides, and they don't even know it because their well water is infrequently tested, often only when you buy or sell your home. And even then, when it's tested, it's usually tested for bacteria because people worry about infectious diseases and often not even tested for pesticides. There's a cluster of individuals in upstate New York, right near the border with Vermont, 24 individuals in this very, very, very small farming community called Hebron, New York, that appear to have Parkinson's disease, and they're trying to figure out why it is, and it may be because of what they're drinking.
Is that the same as tap water? So if somebody just opens a tap, drinks some water, is there pesticides in it?
Usually not. So the tap water that most of us get is coming from a municipality or a city, and that's been regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act, and therefore it's regularly tested. So usually that water from a tap would not have high levels of pesticides. And you can imagine if you're in an urban environment, pesticides would likely not be the predominant contamination. That said, I still put a carbon filter, from Pure or Brita, from your grocery store on my tap at home, so that the water I drink, even though it should be safe, I added another layer of protection. And these carbon filters, which are relatively inexpensive, are actually can be quite effective at decreasing exposure to pesticides and other chemicals in your water that might be contributing to brain diseases or cancer or a wide range of medical conditions.
That's what I like about you. You're very, very particular, and you do the right things to save people from having Parkinson's, and also yourself and also your parents as well.
Yeah. So my parents live in Southern California. So that's why I keep talking about Los Angeles, because you can see the air pollution in Los Angeles. And about 2 Christmases ago, our children got their grandparents air filters because they live in Southern California to decrease the amount of air pollution that they are experiencing in their home. Air filters are a little bit more expensive than water filters, but they too can reduce the amount of particulate matter, those little pieces of dirt and soot in your home, by 30 to 50% in research studies, and maybe even more theoretically. And that's one easy way to decrease your exposure to these toxicants. Of course, the major way to do this is society to ban or reduce or introduce safer alternatives. And we've done that. The air quality in Los Angeles today is 50 to 90% better than at least 50, 90% better than it was in the 1950s and 60s. Then the governor of California said we should eliminate all unnecessary driving. Because air pollution was so bad in Los Angeles. That governor was Ronald Reagan.
I think many people would probably be thinking there's so many things that we have to do. Like people say, avoid eating meat, avoid eating fruits and vegetables, don't go outside because there's the air pollution if you want to avoid disease. And then it's balancing that with living life and trying to be preventative, but also having a good life. What is your tip for that?
Yeah. I used to think the food I ate, the water I drank, and the air I breathed was safe. I no longer believe that. I just don't believe that food, water, and air are safe. And I think there's ample evidence to indicate that. And so I take actions as an individual to the extent I can as an individual based on where I live, what I eat, and what I drink to lower my risk, my individual risk of developing disease. Now, I've been at this for a long time, and thinking about it, the vast majority of people don't have that luxury, don't have the resources, don't have that level of education, which we're trying to provide here. Fundamentally, these are societal decisions. Life expectancy today in the United States is lower than when I was in medical school, and we spend 50% more on healthcare. The answer to improving our health is not spending more on doctors and hospitals. The answer to improving our health is to improve our environment. If we ensure that everyone has clean water and food, all of us will live longer and healthier lives, not just neurologists who have access to information and resources, but all of us can live longer and healthier lives if we all have clean water and food.
Do you think that would substantially decrease the incidence of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's?
Without a doubt. without a doubt. And not only would it do that, it'll decrease the risk of cancer and lots of other health ailments. And we'll spend less on healthcare.
So if you drink clean water, eat clean food, and stay out of pollution, 3 things.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Let's move on to a common dry cleaning chemical. Now, can you pronounce this for me? Trichloroethylene.
Yeah, so it's trichloroethylene. I forgot. I have a little chemistry model of it. I'm sorry, I forgot to bring it. So trichloroethylene, everyone calls it TCE. It has a cousin. It's called perchloroethylene, PCE. Most of what I say for TCE applies to both chemicals. So it's a really simple atom. Most of your listeners remember that water is made up of 3 atoms, H2O, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping 6 atoms. It's made up of 2 carbon atoms, 1 hydrogen, and 3 chlorine atoms, hence its name trichloroethylene. Perchloroethylene is just exactly the same molecule, except it's got a 4th chlorine atom, per just as a prefix meaning 4. These chemicals are widely used. Trichloroethylene was actually, I think, first developed in 1864. So this chemical was developed when Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. Been used since the 1920s. Been used in everything from degreasing metal to dry cleaning clothes to decaffeinating coffee. In 1970, 2 pounds of this chemical were produced per American in the United States. It was found in everything from typewriter correction fluid to carpet cleaners. And it's contaminated up to 30% of the groundwater in the United States. In the 1980s, 1 in 3 American cities had this chemical in its drinking water, hence use those carbon filters. And this chemical is associated with a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Again, research done by Dr. Tanner and her colleagues. And this is the chemical that has contaminated the marine-based Camp Lejeune. So if you're wondering why you're seeing all these TV ads about Camp Lejeune, it's because this chemical, TCE, contaminated the marine-based Camp Lejeune from a dry cleaner and other sources. The Marines knew about it and covered it up. And Marines who served at Camp Lejeune, compared to Marines who served in Camp Pendleton, which was much less contaminated, Marines who served at Camp Lejeune have a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease today because of their service when they were a 20-year-old young man or young woman who was healthy. So these are Marines who are young, healthy, who were exposed to this chemical for about 2 years at high levels, and 35 years later have a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease.
You mentioned TCE is in common things that we do, dry cleaning. I think most people are going to take something to the dry cleaner. Most people are going to have some decaf coffee. The dry cleaning. So if this toxin is in your dry clean clothes, how does that get absorbed in the air that we have in your car, and what happens?
Yeah, so trichloroethylene was widely used in dry cleaning from the 1930s and 1950s. And the reason we use dry cleaning, just to back up, so do you know why we use dry cleaning?
To clean clothes?
Yeah, main reason we use dry cleaning is so our clothes don't shrink. Because if you wash things with water, they shrink. So we're doing all of this so our clothes don't shrink. So just the absurdity of this is crazy. And so we used to use chemicals like kerosene to dry clean, but they had the unfortunate property of being flammable. TCE is not flammable, and then it was replaced by its cousin perchloroethylene in dry cleaning in the 1950s. And so the vast majority of dry cleaners in the United States still today use this chemical called perchloroethylene, or PCE, TCE's cousin. And it's a very volatile chemical. It tends to evaporate. And so when you go to pick up your dry cleaning and you put it into your car, on your way home, PCE is being released from your dry clean shirt or dress or blouse, and you're breathing in PCE as you go, as you drive home. You then take it into your closet, into your bedroom, for example, and you're now going to have PCE in your bedroom. If you have a dry cleaner that's on the ground floor of an apartment building, say in New York City, they've done studies in New York City and they look at the apartment buildings above that dry cleaner. They find PCE at unsafe levels in the apartment buildings above dry cleaners in New York City. So people who are living above in apartments or condominiums above a dry cleaner can be breathing unsafe air and not even know it. The chemical dissolves in fat. I think about 60% of your brain is fat. And so if you open the refrigerator in the apartments above dry cleaners and you eat some butter, you are now eating PCE. So this is it's unbelievable. if you're not grossed out yet, you take your daughter to pick up your dry cleaning, and she has an ice cream cone when you go into the dry cleaner because you went and got ice cream before you picked up your dry cleaning. When she leaves that dry cleaner, she's going to be eating PCE.
So that's T for Tom, in case you can't hear it properly, TCE, because sometimes the audio is a bit funny, trichloroethylene.
Yeah, no, and its cousin perchloroethylene is the one that's used in dry cleaning today. So perchloroethylene, PCE. They're almost the same molecule. They literally differ by one atom. But the one that's used in dry cleaning today in the vast majority of the United States is perchloroethylene, PCE. Now, it's worth mentioning Minnesota and California have both passed laws to phase out perchloroethylene in their states, and the EPA has proposed a ban on this that would phase it out in dry cleaning over the next 10 years. But still today, if you're dry cleaning your clothes, you're likely being exposed to perchloroethylene.
And if you have decaf coffee as well.
So it was found in decaffeinated coffee in the 1970s until the FDA banned that use in the 1970s. So your decaffeinated coffee today should not have it, but in the past it likely did.
So that is the 3 toxins. So air pollution, we need to avoid, including particulate matter. We need to avoid pesticides as much as possible. So we need to be eating clean foods, and we're going to get into the solutions now. And then we also need to avoid trichloroethylene. So just don't do any dry cleaning, or find a dry cleaner that doesn't use this chemical.
Exactly. And you can do that with a green leaf. And that's what I don't dry clean very much, but I when I do dry clean, I use a dry cleaner that does not use that chemical.
Let's now get into some solutions, which you've mentioned previously, but let's just consolidate it so people can know. How do we breathe clean air?
So I think the biggest determinant is like where you live. Now, most people don't have control about where they live, but if you have Parkinson's disease or if you're thinking about retirement, I would think long and hard about where you live. There's a study that's I think from Southern California that looked at women in their 70s who did not have cognitive impairment, who were cognitively normal, thinking was relatively unimpaired, and followed them, I think, for 5 to 10 years and showed that the rate of cognitive decline was greater among women living in heavily polluted areas of Southern California compared to people living in less polluted areas. So I would give, if you can, I'd give consideration to where you live. If you don't have control of where you live, which is the vast majority of people, I would do some things that are readily available to all of us. When I drive through heavy areas of traffic, I would roll up my window and circulate the air in my car so I'm not drawing in air from heavily polluted, trafficked areas and breathing that in. So roll up the windows, recycle the air in your car. If you live in a heavily polluted area, I would consider an air filter, especially putting it in areas of the house where you spend the most time. So, for example, your kitchen and your bedroom. So I think those are things that you can do for air pollution. We don't want to be like China and Mexico, where children color the sky not blue but brown. We don't want to be in China where people are so concerned about air pollution that they produce domes over their schools so that their kids can play soccer without breathing in toxic air. We need to think about what are ways that we can continue to improve our air quality so that all of us can live longer and healthier lives.
Absolutely. So that's very, very simple to use an air purifier. Just be mindful of any smog or air pollution outside. Roll up the windows, use the recycled air. Now, we spoke about drinking clean water, and that's to put a simple carbon filter onto your tap, but the tap water is generally safe.
So I used to think that if you look at the regulations, like the safety threshold for almost all chemicals in our water, for example, forever chemicals, these PFAS chemicals, that has always been declining over time. So what they said was safe 30 years ago, we would say today is not safe. And I always like to think what were people in the future going to say about us today. And so I think people in the future might say the water we drink today is not sufficiently safe. So I'm an exception maybe here, but I am suspect about some of these things. So I put a carbon filter, even though I should expect that my water in suburban Rochester, New York should be safe. I put a carbon filter on it because I want to take an extra level of precaution. And then remember that, 40 million Americans, 1 in 8 Americans get their water from a private well. I would have my well tested for pesticides if I lived in rural areas, or tested for these chemicals, trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, TCE and PCE, if I lived in suburban or urban areas, because these chemicals contaminate up to 30% of the groundwater in the United States. And testing for these chemicals is not routinely done when you just get your well water test.
Okay, noted. Put a carbon filter on your water. Okay, let's move on to something that's a bit more controversial. Milk. What are your thoughts about milk, and does that cause brain disease?
So there have been some studies that have suggested that milk increases your risk, or that high milk consumption is associated with Parkinson's disease. I get less concerned about milk in and of itself. I get concerned about what's in the milk. And so I'll give you an example. So I think it was 1980s, there was a pesticide called heptachlor that had been banned in the United States. But in Hawaii, the Pineapple Growers Association wanted to protect their cash crop and filed for a petition to get an exemption to use heptachlor on pineapples. And they got that exemption. And they sprayed the plants with heptachlor, and the pineapples evidently grew fine. But then they took the top part of the pineapple, the green leafy part, it's called the chop, which had been sprayed also with heptachlor, and then they fed it to cows. And the cows were eating up the grassy part, and they're eating this pesticide called heptachlor. I mentioned that some pesticides like DDT dissolve in fat. Heptachlor is like one of those pesticides that dissolves in fat. So if you're a cow and you're eating something that dissolves in fat, where are you going to put it? Well, you're going to put it in your milk. And then those cows are milked, and their milk makes its way onto the shelves of the stores in Hawaii. And it turns out that they were testing the milk on in Hawaii, and they found it to have high levels of heptachlor and unsafe levels of heptachlor. So they did a milk recall. And just so happened that there were some researchers in Hawaii who were studying aging, and they found out that people who drank high levels of milk had high rates of Parkinson's disease. And then when they looked at the brains of the high milk consumers, they saw loss of nerve cells in the substantia nigra, the loss of those dopamine-producing nerve cells in substantia nigra. What else did they find in those brains? They found the residue of heptachlor in it, because heptachlor is known to damage the dopamine-producing parts of nerve cells. So yes, so the reason I get concerned about milk isn't so much about the amount of nutritional content in it. I mean, there's some reasons to think that milk consumption for adults may not be necessary, but that's a different topic, is that milk products, animal products, concentrate chemicals like pesticides as they go up the food chain. So I get way more concerned about what's in my milk, like pesticides, than I do about milk in and of itself.
I think that is an important clarification because people love their milk. That's why I brought it up. But apparently, if you have caffeine, not coffee, but the caffeine, might be linked to lowering the risk of Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, so caffeine has this chemical in it, adenosine, that might protect nerve cells. And some studies have suggested that high levels of caffeine consumption, not just coffee, but caffeine consumption, may lower your risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So if you enjoy your coffee, caffeinated coffee, there's probably no reason to stop enjoying it from a standpoint of Parkinson's disease.
Well, many of my viewers are coffee lovers, and everybody loves coffee. So,
and if you want to add a dairy product to it, make sure it's organic so you decrease your exposure to any pesticides.
Absolutely. Let's move on to some signs and symptoms of somebody if they're going to get Parkinson's. So let's talk about the very, very early stages, 10, 20 years before it's actually happening, because you alluded to it earlier. What are some signs and symptoms?
So one of the early symptoms of Parkinson's disease is constipation. So you can imagine that if these ingested pesticides, ingested chemicals, TC, are leading to misfolding of protein and damaging of the nerve cells that are responsible for controlling the muscles that move things along in your gut, that constipation might be one of the earliest features of the disease, and it is. And it happens often in some individuals decades before they develop the disease. This is also seen in individuals who might develop something called dementia with Lewy bodies, which is a very similar Parkinsonian disorder. Another early feature of Parkinson's disease is loss of smell. Also another early feature of Alzheimer's disease. If you have a loss of smell, not from COVID-19, but for other reasons, that puts you at really high risk of getting Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. And I think that's because that in both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, the pathology, one of the first places you find pathology for both these diseases is in the smell center or the olfactory bulb. and that can lead to impairment of smell. And I think that tells us constipation and loss of smell being two of the earliest features of the disease might be telling us where this disease is beginning. Not beginning, for example, in the brain, but actually beginning in the nose or in the gut. And the nose and the gut just happen to be the two places of our body that interact with the environment through things that we smell, inhale, or things that we ingest.
Are there any other signs and symptoms that people can be looking at if they might be developing Parkinson's?
So if it begins in the gut, it then spreads up from the gut, and it then goes up to that vagus nerve, and it leads to troubles with constipation. It also affects other part of the autonomic nervous system, the parts of our nervous system that function without us thinking about it, controlling it. Like when we digest food without thinking about it, our heart beats without our thinking about it. And so some people can get lightheadedness when they stand up because they have poor autonomic function. People can also have early sleep disturbances in people, especially with this dementia with Lewy bodies, this other Parkinsonian disorder, and where people act out their dreams. They might even strike their bed partner. And these symptoms can happen before the pathology makes its way up to the substantia nigra, and you get the classic tremor and slowness of movement. So as it marches up, you might get constipation, difficulties managing your blood pressure. Then you can get sleep disturbances, and then you can get the trouble with tremor and slowness in movement. Conversely, if it begins in the nose, it might begin with loss of smell, and then relatively early on, you develop the classic motor features of the disease.
I think overall, if we can avoid the pollution, if we can drink clean water, eat clean foods, we can largely avoid getting Parkinson's and also Alzheimer's. One last question for you. How does the standard conventional therapy fit into the whole picture?
So Parkinson's is treatable. There are highly effective medications to do it. I put exercise in there before we get to medications, and that can be really beneficial for people with the disease and possibly even lower your risk of the disease by 20%. And then the medications replace the dopamine. The most effective medication replaces the dopamine that's lost. It's called levodopa, and it makes Parkinson's disease highly treatable. The real challenge with Parkinson's disease is how to manage the condition after the first 5 to 10 years when it gets increasingly disabling.
And what is the place for deep brain stimulation?
So deep brain stimulation is a surgical treatment for a subset of people with Parkinson's disease. It can be highly effective. It needs to be done at centers where they do lots of it because there's at least a 20% chance of something bad happening. And it decreases the output, that circuit, that basal ganglia circuit that controls movement. One part of that circuit is inappropriately overactive. And so by putting an electrode down into your brain, you can dampen the amount of output from that circuit, from that particular collection of nerve cells, and provide sometimes actually substantial benefit to select people with Parkinson's.
Okay, well, Dr. Dorsey, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to link your book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, in the description of this video, and all the links for these conversations that people can become more aware about Parkinson's disease and brain disease and how we can prevent it. But a big thank you for your time, and I'm sure we're going to see you very soon.
Thank you very much, Rena. And if any of your listeners can't afford a copy of the book, or they have stories that they want to tell me that they worked in dry cleaning or they worked at Camp Lejeune, I'd love to hear from them. They can just email us at info@endingpd.org, info@endingpd.org. And if you can't afford a copy of the book and you'd like one, just email us your mailing address at info@endingpd.org. If you can't afford a copy, buy one. All the authors are donating all their proceeds to efforts to prevent and end Parkinson's disease.
Thank you for joining me today on this episode with Dr. Ray Dorsey, all about how we can prevent Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease and have optimal brain health. You can find the full resources from this episode on the 5-Minute Body Labs, including books, resources, and journal articles. I'll link that in the description of this video. If you're learning from and enjoying these episodes, please feel free to hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support our mission of root cause healing. You can also find me on other social media platforms at 5-Minute Body, including Twitter, now known as X, and also on Instagram. I generally share different information to what you'll find here on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this episode, you'll also enjoy another episode with Dr. Anthony Chafee, all about how to prevent dementia with a high-fat ketogenic diet. Dr. Chafee talks specifically about a high-fat ketogenic diet and real examples of how patients have reversed their dementia and existing Alzheimer's disease. He also talks about the role of statins, how statins actually cause brain disease, including Alzheimer's disease, and what we need to do to reverse it, and also the role of exercise to improve brain function. I'll leave that link right here so you can watch that next. But thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you guys next week.